Hi, I'm Dawn Nelson, and I'm here with the AAPOR Heritage Committee. We're here today at the Kaiser Family Foundation Studios in Washington, D.C. Today is June 26, 2014. I'm extremely happy to introduce Don Dillman, who has graciously agreed to participate and be part of our AAPOR Heritage interview series. I would like just to give a little bit of background before we sort of launch in. Don began in Iowa at the Iowa State University, and then his career transitioned over to Washington State University. And he's, along the way, you've had lots of consulting jobs and a number of contracts with the universities and private sectors and a whole bunch of contracts. And you even had like a 4-year sabbatical, I believe, at the United States Census Bureau. Today, Don is the Regents Professor in the Sociology Department and the Deputy Director for Research and Development in the Social and Economic Sciences Research Center at Washington State University in Pullman. Don, welcome, and thank you for your time today.
Thank you.
Was all that information accurate first?
I think mostly so.
Mostly so? All right, okay. So I'm just really intrigued that you grew up on a farm in Iowa. And
that's where I came from.
That's where you came from.
My family on both sides had been in the same county since about the 1850s. And it was a small rural community. A lot of people had not been very much outside that community. Growing up, it was a big step to go to Iowa State University, which was a whole 84 miles away. I also started college and finished a bachelor's degree as an agronomist. And I think some people find that a little bit strange sometimes, considering the kind of work I do now. The thing that happened there is when you grow up in that community where I was very much involved in 4-H. There were extension agents I knew that were agronomists, and I did what seemed natural and appropriate. So for 4 years, I took a lot of botany, I took a lot of chemistry, soil science, crop production, and 3 months before I graduated, I was accepted on an international farm youth exchange program to go to Poland for 6 months. And that was an incredible time. And being away from the campus, it also made it clear to me that I just wasn't as interested in agronomy and crop production as I was in people and the kinds of things people do and how they behave. So when I came back from Poland, I talked to some people, and I was very fortunate that a rural sociologist there, George Beale was his name, said, "We've taken a chance on other people." And I had done pretty well as an undergraduate, and you can start to work for us, and you see how you like us, and we'll see how we like you.
Okay. Well, obviously that must have been a wonderful relationship if you've been there since 1969?
I started that in 1964.
64, okay.
As a graduate student.
Okay.
First thing they did was give me a box of questionnaires, and I still remember that box because it was about so full of questionnaires, and each of them was about that thick. And sent me to Madison County, Iowa. That's where the Madison County bridges are, the covered bridges.
Okay.
And I had a map with yellow squares on it that had been marked with some kind of marker that we had in those days. And I was supposed to go to those squares and interview people, farmers. And they were almost all farmers, and it was how I got introduced to survey research.
That's really interesting. And so from there, what was then your next venture in terms of the field? What was the thing that was really exciting for you at that time?
Well, trying to learn sociology because it was a huge leap from agronomy. In agronomy, I understood science and how it worked and experimentation. All those things were just very much part of that curriculum. And I had a lot of natural science background, but I didn't have the social science or liberal arts perspective to allow me to have a lot of the social side of understanding human behavior. So I kind of came in the back door on that. But maybe the interesting thing, what happened then that really I think launched my career was I got my doctorate finished, and my major professor kept me employed for another 4 months. And he walked into the shop. That's where we were. There were 20 graduate students, I think, at the time that worked for him and 3 other professors. He walked in and said, "Dillman, so you think you're a political scientist?" And I kind of looked at him because I had a political science major, mostly on the philosophy of social thought, which went back to Aristotle and, and some others. But he said, "I'm on a committee. We just had a bond issue on Ames to build a new city hall, and it got defeated. The mayor wants to know why it was defeated." And he said, and I quote, "Why don't you round up members of the shop, write a telephone questionnaire, do a survey, find out what people think and whether or not the bond issue should be put up again." And I did what we did on the farm all the time. You get sent out to plow a field or disc or harrow something, you go out and you do it, and if it isn't being done quite right, you adjust and do something differently, and you don't go back and ask how to do it. It's just assumed that you can figure it out. And I didn't know at the time that no one had really done telephone surveys before. So I took my face-to-face interview experience. I said, "We can't use show cards, and those long questions, let's get rid of those and let's ask shorter questions." And so I made adaptations on that. I put together the questionnaire. I ran it off myself on a Mimeo machine. We had Mimeo and Ditto in those days. No fax machine yet. No copy machines. It was a very different time. But I put together that questionnaire. I went around to members of the shop, all of whom were fairly practically oriented like I was. I gave them a list of telephone numbers I drew from the directory. They went home, they made those phone calls. I think we probably got about an 80% response, or maybe higher on that. It was a very salient issue in the city. Wrote up the report in a few days, gave it to George Beale, and that was pretty much it. And then I left for Pullman. Unbeknownst to me, when I got to Pullman, there was a lot happening there because it was the Vietnam War, and there were protests on campus, and I had no idea about some of the dynamics and how that might affect me. But the 2 things that happened immediately was, first of all, I didn't have any money to do research, and while I was a graduate student, we had budgets, and so I had to look for something inexpensive. So my first venture in surveying, because surveying is what I'd learned, was to do mail questionnaires. And a faculty member there, Walter Slocum, helped me get that set up and said, "Well, I've used that over in Montana and other places, and it kind of works, and you ought to try it, Don." So I looked at that, and I looked at the stuff that people put in envelopes, and I thought it was horrible. And here's where the technology change really comes in, because we had just got to the place where we could get printed letters on stationery, and then we could put it in a typewriter, insert the address in a very similar font, and I could put a personal signature at the bottom of it, and it was a real letter. And that was sort of the basis of the mail work I was starting to do. And that, then I got asked about it from other people of how to do things, and I started working on that. And so that was underway. Meantime, the campus erupted, and the chair of the sociology department went to administration and said, "Well, you know, if we had a telephone survey laboratory, we could do quick surveys of students and find out what they're thinking, and that would be useful to know." And so he was immediately looking for somebody to set up a telephone survey lab. And one way of putting it is I was more qualified than anybody else, probably in the university, to set up that survey lab, because I was the only one that had ever done a telephone survey. And so we started setting up a telephone survey lab. Meantime, the university was closed down, and we did not finish spring semester because of student strikes, which changed over to a racism issue away from the Vietnam War. But those were kind of difficult times in most universities in the country, I think. So then what happened was that we started calling people on dial phones, and lo and behold, we got a response rate of between 70 and 80%, and it didn't look that difficult. So I'd done two surveys, and then a third and a fourth and a fifth, and so I had this experience, and I was also working with mail. I didn't go out to the Washington State planning to do mail and telephone surveys, and that's kind of the point of this, but suddenly I was doing them, and I found out that I was reasonably good at doing it, and I really enjoyed it. Then, maybe the next thing that happened historically that is important is people knew I was doing telephone and mail surveys, and my department head in rural sociology asked me one day to teach his course because he wanted to do a day on survey methods. And I had a bunch of slides that I'd put together because I'd been taught in graduate school to use overheads, and slides were coming in vogue, these little 2x2 things that you put into a slide projector.
Yes.
Which we don't use anymore, but those were pretty good in those days. And so I'd put these slides together, and I took him to class. All the way back from class, he was on one side of me, then the other side of me. He was quite a bit shorter than me. Howard Barr was his name. He's a professor now at Brigham Young University. But he said, "Don, there's a book in here. You need to write it." Well, when a department head in those days said, "You need to write a book," the logical thing to do probably as an assistant professor was to sit down and start to write a book. And so I started to work on that. And then on the telephone, another thing happened. The director of the Social and Economic Sciences Research Center, as it's called now, Jim Short, he invited a friend of his, Peter Rossi, who, former AAPOR member, and he had been director at National Opinion Research Center. He came for a visit to Pullman, and Jim was looking for things for him to see and said, "Well, Don, why don't you do a presentation for him?" So I did a presentation for Rossi, hoping I could learn some things. And he sat very quietly, and it was just only, I don't know, 5 or 6 of us in the survey lab. And we got done, and then I asked him, I said, "Well, you know, what can I do? How can I improve this?" And he looked back at me and said, "Well, you're ahead of me on this. I'm not sure what you can do. I haven't done these things before." And that was the first inkling I had that I was really working on something that other survey methodologists thought maybe was useful. That the research literature wasn't out there. I had a research assistant assigned to me. Actually, the guy that was assigned to me became Mick Cooper's major professor in South Africa. Anyway, I asked Max to go to the library and find articles on telephone surveying. And after about the 4th or 5th trip, he had 4 articles, none of which were really telling me anything about telephone surveys, so there just wasn't much literature. So then that first book, that 1978 book.
I just happen to have a copy of it
Yeah,
here.
mail and telephone surveys.
That's right.
The Total Design Method. You might be interested in why it's got that subtitle, Total Design Method. I knew very little about writing books at that time, or articles for that matter. But I started writing about these procedures, and I was trying to explain how to get response, especially to mail surveys. And I wanted to say, you pay attention to detail and everything in there. And so my subtitle at the time was called Maximal Systematic Manipulation. The editor for the Wiley series at the time took one look at that, and he said, "You got to be kidding." And he said, "You need to rethink that." I went back and rethought it and put several things on the wall in front of me, and that's where Total Design Method came from. And I was trying to say, you need to look at everything instead of just one thing. Okay. My main memory of one thing that happened there that I'll not forget is several years after I'd gotten really established on this and the book had been out and making an impact, somebody came to Pullman who was really another famous sociologist, and I heard that he wanted to meet with me, and the word came down from the department head, "You need to come upstairs because so-and-so wants to see you." And I went upstairs. And he said, "Oh, Don, I've been looking forward to meeting you." What I really want to know is, can I get a really good response rate if I put commemorative stamps on the envelopes instead of just regular stamps? And I thought, I walked out of that office and I thought, good grief, I've not succeeded very well here, because you just don't take one thing and then make that the secret to getting response, that you need to approach people like they're reasonable human beings and do many things. Just like we, if an automobile manufacturer tried to sell cars based on the color of paint and nothing else, it wouldn't work. You have to think of a whole bunch of things that have to fit together, and I think that's what we have to do when we do surveying.
Well, I'm curious about how, with technology over time, and the movement into internet surveys, the visual design and other types of things. If you could maybe talk a little bit about your thinking through the years in terms of how technology has then led us to do different types of things. You alluded to some with the mention of the typewriter, with the personalization.
Well, in that 1978 book, you have we put quite an emphasis there on laying out full pages and making things fit together, controlling our margins, trying to get things to go with people's eye flow. We used dotted leaders to go across the page from items in a series, that we'd have an item and then we'd have strongly agrees, somewhat agree, and so forth, or not a priority, a small priority, medium priority, high priority. And so we laid those things out, and I didn't understand much about visual science at all then, but I was doing it almost as art form. That I thought, well, I've got to make these fit and make them look nice. And then I started numbering the questions out at the side and some other things that are back in there. And that seemed to work. And then it's kind of a longer story, what happened on how that got developed further, but it involved going to the Census Bureau. You mentioned that I was there during the 90s. Bob Groves had become the Associate Director for Standards, I think was his title. And he called me and asked me if I would come out to the Census Bureau to work on redesigning the decennial census. And my first reaction was, you got to be kidding, because I said, I don't think I'm a strong enough statistician to do what people at the Census Bureau do. His response was, he said, you don't understand the problem. That it's really, we're trying to deal with the response that people have to the questionnaire. And it's not the matter of coverage and the sampling design, although there's not so much sampling there except for the long form at the time. And he said, we've got all kinds of statisticians, and you'll find it's great to work with them. And I thought about that a little bit and talked to university, because I was kind of at a time when I'd finished up some stuff, was trying to figure out what to do next. And they let me go on what's called the Intergovernmental Personnel Act, or an IPA. And so the Census Bureau paid the university for me being out at Census. And so I came out, and I was the first person in that position, the senior survey methodologist position. It was set up in 1991 when I went to the Bureau. And then after 2 years, my wife, Joy, and I needed to be getting back to Pullman because she's a professor in human development. And so we went back, and then I commuted for 2 more years from Pullman. It's a 2,046-mile commute. So I was doing that twice a month. But, oh, wow, it was exciting to be at Census Bureau. But you asked about visual design, but there were some other things, because I was trying to deal with response and how to improve it and do experiments. And one of the first things we did was on visual layout and design. In fact, one of the things that's interesting there is that the 1990 census form is not one that's easy to comprehend and follow through, but it was built for an optical reading, and FOSDIC it was called. And I understand why it was built that way. But to follow it as a person and a respondent I actually had people in focus groups that I'd done try to fill out the form, and I found that they were trying to fill out the explanatory form or the instructions and getting embarrassed because they saw other people going and picking up another sheet of paper that was in there because there were multiple sheets of paper in it. And so there was a lot of potential there, I thought, for improvement. And we tried to do some visual improvement. And my secretary in Pullman had a new Mac computer. And we tried to lay out some visually good ways of putting together those pages in a flow, building on what I'd done in the '78 book.